Assalamu alaikum. Hello and welcome to our In Conversation event with Shaykh Abdal Hakim Murad, which follows on from last year's hugely popular online event, which garnered over 20,000 views. I'm your chair, Ramona Ali, and I am delighted to welcome the Shaykh in real life to Bradford, where we continue our journey discussing his latest book, Travelling Home, Essays on Islam in Europe. Shaykh Abdal Hakim Murad, also known as Dr. Tim Winter, is a lecturer in Islamic studies at the University of Cambridge and is the Dean of Cambridge Muslim College, which aims to develop Muslim faith leadership. His insightful, honest, and articulate book gives key insights into the character and complexity of Islam in Europe. I'd like to welcome Shaykh Abdal Hakim Murad onto the stage now. Thank you. Shaykh, we are so grateful and that you've been so generous with your time with us today and to join us in person for our very anticipated conversation.
Thank you. It's great to be back in Bradford.
And we love to have you here. After our discussion, we will be opening to the audience for a series of Q&A. But first, let's start off by the book's main title itself, Travelling Home. You know, it gives the sense of home being an ongoing process to find. And, you know, it's often a complicated word, home, when it comes to Muslims. You know, many of us have multiple identities and we sometimes grapple with that sense of belonging. Now, I read that Abraham, from a Semitic point of view, in the Semitic language, it means traverser. So is Islam similarly about being a constant traverser?
Well, the title, I suppose, invokes some fairly obvious themes and tropes in the Muslim imagination, one of which is that life is itself, perhaps as you suggest, Ramona, a kind of journey back home, al-rihla ila al-watan, the idea of God as the point of origin and the point of return, al-mabda' wal-ma'ad is kind of cliche in our literature. So that, I suppose, in the context of the book's analysis of the supposed Muslim crisis in Europe, reminds us that this is, in any case, a place of sojourning and that we have a final destination which should be the basic sort of source of our moral reasoning. But yes, in the case of Abraham, all of those old Genesis stories have launched such rich trajectories of speculation and identity. And Abraham, of course, is in the Quran as well as in Genesis the archetypal knight of faith with a K, as Kierkegaard calls him. He kind of heroically, in this futuwa way, travels not just from persecution to a refuge, but also from plurality to unity, from a false exile to an exile that is at home in God, and all of those various picaresque events in his life, many of which are present in the Quran, of course, indicate that life itself is a pilgrimage, but one which we need to view monotheistically. In other words, one that has a master signifier, which is Abraham as Khalilullah, God's intimate. So however much he travels, he is still Khalilullah, he is still with God.
And in one of your responses to our online conversation last year, you said that non-Muslimness has been a part of the defining character of the identity of the European continent. You know, as we witness the rise of populism and nationalism, do you think that Islamophobia or anti-Muslim sentiment, whatever you want to call it, is an intrinsic part of the socio-historic inheritance of Europe?
Well, one cannot be angry if Europeans, angered by the confiscation of identity that modernity seems to impose with globalization and rapid change, look to their past, to their national and religious narratives for a sense of continuity and a sense of having coordinates in a confusing world. The question is, what do they find there? And in the case of Europe, there is much that is disturbing. There are some positive things, and I explain how Muslims can plug into those at various points in the book. But it is also the case that Europe historically was created by Islam. That is to say that The Romans didn't see themselves as a European empire, they were a Mediterranean empire, and it was only with the Muslim conquest, which gobbled up most of the lands of antiquity, that the last little bit that wasn't gobbled up, basically the Frankish Germanic kingdoms in the sort of top left-hand corner of the known world, they were the place that eventually started to define themselves as Europeans. So the first use of the word European is actually in narratives of Christians fighting against Muslims in France and Spain. And this is one of the things that can be troubling about the current understandable European search for selfhood, which is that so much of the European narrative is violent in its discursive rejection of Jews internally, which Europe is kind of post-Holocaust trying to come to terms with, but there's still work to be done there. But the other Semite, in other words, the Arab, the Moor, the Saracen, that has become a new neuralgic problem, because he is not just on the other side of the Pyrenees, but is in Bradford and Moscow, and it becomes really something that pushes at the tenderest point of Europe's self-understanding. So if you look at, for instance, Western Europe's best-known pilgrimage, which is the road of Santiago to Santiago de Compostela in northern Spain, which is the biggest pilgrimage destination for Catholics in the Middle Ages, and probably still today. When you get to the cathedral in Compostela, at the center of the cathedral there is the image of St. James. That's supposedly where he's buried. It isn't, but that's the story. Santiago Matamoros is his title. In other words, his title is St. James the Muslim Killer. So you've walked and said your pious prayers all the way across Europe, and then you come to the big statue of St. James the Muslim Killer, and there he is on his horse with his white face, and he's trampling on Muslims, and he's cut the heads off half of them, and they have black, scary faces, and that's the center of Western Europe's key shrine. And he's still the patron saint of Spain. So that narrative, that in many ways defining aspect of European identity, of course, is going to be very difficult for Muslims to integrate into. And the big question for the European identitarians at the moment is the extent to which they want to reanimate that old image of Europeanness being primarily that which excludes Muslimness. And I think some of them are starting to do that. If you see the rise of the far right in France and across the continent now, what is Europe? They're not really sure, but they do know what Europe is not, which is kind of something. And what it is not is the Moor, the Saracen, the Ishmaelite, the asylum seeker, the visible Semitic other. This, I think, is a genuine threat, probably the largest threat in the short to medium term in the European horizon at the moment. And it's hard to know how we, living here, can deal with that, because these fringes of Europe have been defined in extremely conflictual ways. So the book has a chapter on the very recent conflict in Bosnia, which was a very medieval type struggle supported by the church on one side and Muslims being ethnically cleansed on the other. Quite a disturbing story. And then further east, when Boris Johnson became Prime Minister, the Muslim world said, oh, he has a Circassian great-grandfather who memorized the Quran, which in the Muslim world means something, but in the West people aren't quite sure, well, what is Circassia, where is Circassia? It's all very weird. It's Europe's biggest massacre in the 19th century. 85% of them were killed in cold blood, and for Muslims that's kind of a Holocaust memory. Europeans, not quite sure. So this is one of the things that I'm trying to struggle with in the book. What does it mean for Europe to have, as its largest minority everywhere now, that community against whose identity and religion Europe has historically constituted itself? How can that work?
That is fascinating as well. You talk about Saint Jago, Saint James. It was also picked up by Shakespeare, isn't it? So is it that kind of prevailing theme then that that Jago brings the downfall of Othello, the Moor.
There's a kind of sometimes convergence in the way in which the European imagination regards the Jew and the Saracen as being two aspects of the same thing. They're kind of fellow Semites. They're circumcised, they don't eat pork, they're kind of legalistic, they deny Christ, etc., etc. So there's been quite a lot of interesting academic work on the resemblances between Islamophobia and anti-Semitism, and the extent to which the far right, now no longer always anti-Semitic, have battened on Muslim minorities as a kind of vicarious anti-Semitism. And that too, I think, has a very deep and obviously for us conflictual and disturbing heritage.
And within this environment of rising hatred, how do Muslims develop resilience and divine trust? I mean, how do Muslim communities in Europe move forward in claiming our identities as European Muslims or British Muslims?
I think that this is again a challenge, that it is not enough simply to tell Europeans how they should construct their identity and not to be Islamophobic. We have the right to not be hated, I guess. But there has to be a conversation within Muslim communities themselves about what it means to migrate Abrahamically, that is to say, not with the dream of going back home, because Abraham doesn't do that. He migrates into a new space. But what resources Islamic theology and Islamic law and those gigantic, usually neglected libraries that the Muslims have accumulated over 14 centuries of wisdom and reflection, what is in that heritage that can provide us internally with a theology and a discourse of conviviality that can push back against that negativity and turn it into not just a zero-sum game or an attempt to find some kind of compromise, but can turn it into something positive. In other words, in the monotheistic story, there is bushra, there is good news. Muslims should see themselves as coming to new places as bringers of good news and something positive, rather than endlessly grumbling about Islamophobia. We need more laws and we need more halal meat in the military and those grievance issues, some of which need to be pursued, for sure. The society does need to adjust to difference. But as well as just being defensive, to have a clearer sense of what it is that Muslim communities are offering to a continent that is in a state of advanced spiritual starvation, really. There is not much spirituality out there any longer. And that also has so many other crises, the population crisis, which is part of one of the neuralgic issues that surrounds Muslims in Europe. That the Muslim birth rate is 2.9 babies per European Muslim mother, which is not outrageously high, but which is a healthy rate. The non-Muslim birth rate is 1.9 and going down, which means that at some point this conversation has to be resolved, not just in terms of tolerant multiculturalism, but of there being a mutual need and respect. Otherwise, we're going to see some kind of progressive breakdown. We're seeing it in France already. Macron's kind of nationalizing of French mosques is a very extraordinary thing for the French Republic ever to do, but this is how desperate things have become. So one of the things that we can do and should easily be doing is pointing to the indispensability of Muslims in Europe. So not enough people noticed that the first 3 hospital doctors who died of COVID were all Muslims. Where would the NHS be without this diversity? It's not a question of their being here on a kind of liberal sufferance. It's indispensable to the proper working of these societies. So that narrative needs to be developed much more strongly. But also, I think the sense that Muslims should perceive themselves as being in Europe as bearers of something that Europe is increasingly missing, which is what was always at the center of the European identity. God is the master signifier of European history, and certainly of British history, but in the last generation or two it's kind of got out of focus. So Muslims as the reminders of the monotheistic principle, I think, is one of the key roles that we can perform, because for whatever reason, and I do speculate a bit in the book about why this is the case, the rate of transmission of religiosity in Muslim families to the new generation is much higher than it is amongst Christians in Europe. So the community is here to stay, but what is it that we are proclaiming? How can we fill that God-shaped hole in the European heart? How do we do that is in a way both faithful to those libraries, but also is not disruptive of people's legitimate right to have their own sense of self as French, German, British, or whatever. We don't have the right to invite them to another culture. We can invite them back to God, but it shouldn't be at the price of something that's essential to their identity. So This, I think, is really important, and I don't think Muslim communities are really thinking along these terms at the moment. They're still involved with community issues, identity issues, bread and butter issues. They're not thinking ahead to the potential crises that are coming and to the ways in which our tradition, which historically is very good at travelling, this idea you began with, and enculturating itself into diverse spaces. So the pre-modern Islamic world was the biggest pre-modern world, from the Pyrenees to China, very different in each of those places. So what will be the nature of that enculturation process in Bradford, for instance? What will it look like in 50 years' time, in a way that everybody can look at and be happy about and relaxed about? I think that's an important thing that communities should be talking about.
Yeah, and you also talk about how, that Muslims should learn to live at home in the languages of Europe, as it's in these languages that we will be heard, and that we should excavate genres and themes to help enrich our sensibilities. So, there is always a lack of support around creativity and the arts. How do we go about more effectively supporting local creative production?
There is a widespread perception that Muslims came to this country as kind of people who crawled out of a jungle somewhere who need to learn to read and write. There is not a sufficient awareness that they are coming from cultures that have, in many cases, an older history and a richer history, even than our old and rich tradition in England. So I was in an interfaith group in Aberdeen, and they were saying, well, we want to do some Rumi. So I said, do you know that the Bangladeshi Imam of the mosque in Aberdeen has memorized the whole Masnavi of Rumi? A guy who nobody would look at on the bus and would assume, well, just another waiter in a restaurant or something. A lot of the Muslims who come here come as heirs to an extraordinarily rich culture. Now, that culture may well be established in certain oriental modes that may not translate particularly well. The Rose Garden and the Nightingale and Layla and Majnun, it's charming, but it takes a certain cultural jump to get to that space. But it is a point of departure, and one does see across Europe. I would say particularly in Scandinavia, in the Balkans, there's 1 million Muslims in Moscow, for instance, who have their own TV station, and they're really productive. That the new generation is finding a voice that is not just a continuation of the old voice of the Rose Garden and the Nightingale, but is something that is a little bit more gritty, a little bit more inner city, a little bit more related to the coalface of difficult existence and coexistence in modern Europe. So there's a lot of stuff out there. But generally, the mosques are stuck in a first-generation cultural space and don't really know how to host or to encourage that. So, one of the things that happens at Bradford Literature Festival, I suppose, is that it is a free space where these new hybrid types of culture can construct their stuff. And I think we'll see more of that.
And we hope to see more of that in the British Muslim communities as they continue to emerge and grow and evolve. So in Britain and other parts of Europe, we see more people turning to atheism, perhaps, or humanism. Even while 80% of the world is religiously affiliated, there is this growing atheistic kind of lens that we're given to view the world in. Does this mean that Muslims are being more otherized than they were as the religious other? Or do you believe that there's an opportunity here for a different kind of engagement?
Well, it's an opportunity, but it's an obligation. And actually the book has a chapter about how we get our heads around this strange situation, because where we visit Muslim libraries for guidance on how you deal with existence within the Sharia as a minority in a Christian country, and that generally was what they were talking about and envisaging, the shelves are bare, really, when you look for guidance on what to do in a society that doesn't really believe in any absolutes at all, that has no conception of human beings as made in the image of God, of the intrinsicality of virtue, of what happens after death, of those things that historically shaped and coloured everybody's lives everywhere, but now have kind of been lost. How do we deal with this? They're not Ahl al-Kitab any longer. They're practical issues about who you can marry, for instance. Meat that's slaughtered by people who don't really care about anything metaphysically. And this is a new situation, and I think that we need to develop a new theology in order to deal with that. remarking, of course, on the fact that our dialogue with Christians and Jews is going to be 1,000 times easier than it is with people who just believe in a void and whose art is just a kind of excited vertigo experience when you stand at the edge of a void, the space where religion used to be, which is what you get when you go to Tate Modern, for instance. The excitement of nothingness, ex nihilo, nihil fit. Well, it's a kind of thrill standing at the edge of the void, but after seeing 500 installations at Tate Modern, evocations of people's sense of existential angst, it gets a little bit disheartening. Easier to go to the old Tate Gallery, where you see people who believed in God and there's an idea that beauty is meaningful and the world is hopeful. So it is a challenge, and I think that one of the problems facing Muslim integration in Europe is that Europe has run away from most of those things where we used to have common ground with them. That despite the horrors of St. James the Muslim killer and the Inquisition and the Circassian genocide, there was still a bigger overlap space with the medievals than is the case now, and a certain triumphalist, aggressive atheism that takes itself to be the default or the normalcy, which historically it's never been. It's always been right out there with flying saucer believers as a strange ideology, but now it's kind of assumed that this is what everybody is. But if you want to do your own faith tradition in private somewhere where nobody gets to hear about it, society will still tolerate that. But if you enter the public square, explosions. If you're a Catholic in the House of Lords, anxious about abortion, people will cancel you pretty quickly.
And so those
and
spaces,
it's likely to get worse.
And so those spaces seem to be becoming more restrictive for us, even not even there. We're absent from those. We're being pushed out in a way, in certain ways.
I mean, it's a question for atheists as well. To what extent do they envisage their liberal utopia as being inclusive in the sense of really including genuine difference? Or do they just mean including the kind of things and social practices and sexualities that they are comfortable with? Is that all they mean by inclusivity? In which case we might say, well, that's not really very inclusive, is it? And that's the Muslim or the religious complication of the current culture wars. Religion makes that neuralgic polarity even more difficult.
But there's also this sense of, like, in the individual, we see modern day influencers and the narratives around celebrating our sense of self. It could be called the age of the individual, but would it be fair to say that Islam supports the individual but not individualism?
Probably, with most of these issues, I think one is speaking more or less in harmony with all of the world's sacred traditions, in other words, with everybody, apart from a few sort of tortured intellectuals in northwestern Europe and perhaps the eastern coast of the United States, but otherwise the world is still religious. That in that context, I think that probably the future has to be about determining the viability of a secular ethic. How well will it work? And for individualism, pushing a bit harder. They're saying in the schools, when you're 3 years old, you can decide on huge decisions, gender, sexuality, whatever. Now, freedom of choice on those things is in itself a public good. But when the human subject is being loaded with so much capacity for making such big decisions, we then have to push and say, well, what is this individual? What is the self? What is your model of consciousness? And the Enlightenment assumed 2 centuries ago that we were going to push religion away and that man would be the measure of all things. Because the way to liberation was through authentically belonging to yourself and your sense of self. And that's the essence, really, I guess, of the liberal project. But now we have the neuroscientists who are saying, actually, there is no consciousness, there is no self. The kind of Daniel Dennett, Donald Wegner idea that we don't have conscious will. The mind is completely automated, there's no consciousness. That scientific conclusion really blows the old liberal apotheosis of human choice out of the water, because it's all just an illusion. But also the postmodern turn, I guess, with its disaggregation of selfhood and the reality of discernible other human selves, feeds into that. So we're at, I think, possibly quite a dangerous point in the evolution of European ethics, that on the one hand, more and more choices are being devolved from traditional communities, religious communities, etc., onto the conscience of the individual. But the individual is philosophically and scientifically subject to potentially fatal challenges as to whether it exists or not. And I think that that contradiction can yield to instabilities that could be really risky in future. And you can see the Chinese government is quite clear about there's no soul, consciousness is just an aspect of brain function. Therefore, we can behave in a way that suits the state rather than in accordance with any alleged moral universals, which are just a kind of effusion from somebody's brain at the time of the French Revolution, but aren't universals in any defensible sense. So totalitarian outcomes from highly scientific and also Darwinian visions of the human creature have led to the greatest catastrophes in Europe in the last 100, 150 years. It's embarrassing to many biologists, but Stalin and communism did come out of a reading of Darwinism. Hitler and the Nazis did come out of a particular reading of Darwinism and the survival of the fittest. So the idea that a scientific worldview and this reductionist idea of the individual is going to lead to a more moral world is something that we need to be questioning them about. They assume it, but it's by no means demonstrated.
And I was actually really fascinated by your chapter on creation spirituality, where you highlight the green man, who in British and European folklore is a representation of nature, and people might also recognize him in perhaps Lord of the Rings. So some of us may have heard of green men. Oh, sorry. But I'm intrigued to know how you present the relationship of the green man with Islam and al-Khidr. So would you like to tell us a bit more?
One is dealing with sort of a very ancient oral folklore and trying to establish forms of linear influence and generalizing about what this very striking but rather enigmatic figure might mean. It's going to be difficult. So the chapter is quite speculative, but still you have this figure of the green man with the acanthus leaves coming from the mouth and the eyes and the wild hair. It looks like a pagan image. It's got nothing to do with any biblical story. And it's across the old world. So you'll see it at St. Magnus Cathedral in Orkney, for instance. There he is, looking a little bit alarming. And then also in imagery in Java, in Indonesia. Really a very well-traveled green man. And very common, I think, particularly for the imagery, because Islam doesn't do images very much, in the church architecture of Western Europe. The Orthodox are not so interested. So I look at that and think, well, this is odd. Is this a sign of the church triumphant over the unregenerate forces of nature because they're subject to original sin, so the green man is always lurking in the dusty corners of a Gothic church, but the real business that's abrogated him is the altar? Like some of those other goblins that you see carved into our cathedrals, is it a symbol of the old religion? Well, a lot of neo-pagans in England will say, yes, and we used to be in a Celtic Eden and would dance around singing mystical songs at Stonehenge at the summer solstice, and then the wicked monotheists came along and spoilt all of our fun and made us wear clothes and stopped us getting drunk. There is that narrative in our culture, which is quite common in some of the eco-warrior movements, that Judeo-Christian morality, with its problematizing of the body and of pleasure and of nature, is the ideology that has generated this turbo-capitalism that has destroyed the planet. That's a common narrative. But the green man, many historians think, is one of those themes that comes to Europe, because you don't really get it in Roman iconography on very early Christian images. It comes in at the time of the Crusades. And if you've looked at Diana Dark's book, which actually published after my book came out, Stealing from the Saracens, she is this art historian who has produced this book showing that the English Gothic is basically Islamic architecture that was brought back to Europe by Crusaders. The stained glass windows, the ogee arches, the whole Gothic thing is Islamic. And you can point to the genealogy of the rose window of Chartres, for instance, that goes back to Umayyad designs in Khirbat al-Mafjar, and it's pretty well established. Before the Crusades, Europe was Romanesque. So that's an aspect of Islam's spiritualizing and enriching of Europe. And there are some who think that the idea of the green man was imported in esoteric circles, Rosicrucian, Templar, who knows, from Sufi or possibly Ismaili circles in the Near East, where the green man is identified with this, in the Quran, Surah Al-Kahf, mystical teacher of Moses, who reminds Moses of the limitations of purely exoteric reading of scripture and of law. So that's my way of getting into what I call creation spirituality. But it certainly is the case that a classical Islamic understanding of matter, nature, the body, actually provides a very good basis for a kind of eco-warrior ethic, I would say. We don't believe in original sin. We've never had a tradition of monasticism or the celibate problematizing of the body and human sexuality. It's much more world-affirming. The Quran talking about the animals and the natural world, praising God. It's a kind of hymn to a natural symphony, which is something that you won't find in the Gospels, for instance, where it is God, man, sin, resurrection. It's quite linear and binary, according to at least Augustine's reading of the Gospels. So, yeah, I think another thing that Muslims need to be doing is to get into that eco-warrior space. Because after all, it's not religion, really, that has trashed the planet, which is the biggest issue of all. It's more important than Muslim migrants and Marine Le Pen, because it's threatening all of us, and it's pretty outrageous. It's materialism. It's the Enlightenment, the Industrial Revolution, the instrumentalizing of God's creation for usually very base human desires and needs and the consumer madness that we all live in. So, yeah, I think that's another... There are Muslims who are working quite extensively in the area of green theologies, particularly in Indonesia, Morocco, and so forth. A lot of people don't realize that Morocco is joint first with Sweden in its switch to sustainable energy sources. They're way ahead of Britain or France or these other places, despite all these boasts about wind farms. The Moroccans are way ahead. And the Ministry of Habous with Ahmed Tawfiq have a theology for this. This is from the Quran. We're not wasteful people. We use God's blessings, and wind farms and their solar power is big because it's Morocco, have a theological basis. So it's not just theory, but it is being put into practice. 1,000 new eco-mosques in Indonesia have just been announced. Yeah. So again, this is a way of making Muslims seem not just like a community with issues and grievances, but a community with a message that can actually save the world, because global warming doesn't stop at national religious frontiers.
And you also have your own eco-mosque in Cambridge as well.
Which has done a lot of good for the image of the local Muslim community, because nobody really supports global warming, as far as I know. It's not a very controversial thing to do a sustainability-based mosque. So, yeah, it's been quite good for our PR. And it also saves the electricity bills, which is nice as well.
Stunning. And you mentioned, talking of beauty as well, about that mosque, but you mentioned beauty as part of healing and restoring who we really are. And we're seeing like the disappearance of beautiful architecture, of some of our heritage. We're also, as you say, less connected with nature. Often we view nature often through an Instagram post than in real life. But so how do we reclaim that pursuit of beauty, and how do we give ourselves that healing?
Well, the Quran is more or less explicitly telling you, take the train to Ilkley and go for a walk. That's a loose translation. But basically, it's talking about travel, siru, travel, and look at the wonders of God's creation in the heavens and the earth and the sunrise. It's very characteristic in its nature, mysticism. So that's a commandment that I think we've neglected, and there's no real need for that. And the human sense of a reconnection with something nostalgic, primordial, healing that we get when we look at something beautiful in nature is not just the brain playing tricks with us, but is a real spiritual nostalgia. It's platonic, it's a recollection of a place from which we've come, the source of nature. And of course, Islamic art is precisely that. Islamic art is abstract, that uses two themes in particular. It uses the geometry of the arabesque to bring out to the surface the miracle that beneath the rough surface of everything there is perfect symmetry and geometry, and the world is made of order. It's not made of chaos, which is a sign of God, because order doesn't just pop up out of nothing. The best explanation of it is that somebody put it there. And then the other dimension of Islamic art is, of course, life, the miracle of life and nature. So wherever you go and look at Muslim decorations, you see the strict geometry of the arabesque, but you also see the vegetal swirlings, the tessellations, which are about the miracle that something can live. And this is said to be related to the divine names Al-Hayy, Al-Qayyum, and it has a gender dimension as well. It's part of our theology of gender. So there's a lot that needs to be not invented, I think, because actually I don't think there's much that's really shockingly new in the book. I'm just trying to visit some other corners of the library to say, hey, well, let's look at this richness that we've inherited. And a lot of it is about nature and about the ways in which nature can heal us, physically as well as spiritually.
Mm-hmm. And I mean, we often live in a world of anger as well, in an age of anger. But in your book and in our conversations, your emphasis has always been on compassion, and that's the key thread, I feel, throughout. And when it comes to dealing with wrongs or injustices, is compassion more empowering than anger? Should we be submitting?
Well, there are times when anger is an appropriate physiological and spiritual response to outrage. If you see Gaza being trashed yet again, just to say, oh, atawakkal ala Allah, and be kind of neutral in a stoic way is inhuman. God has created these reflexes within us to have an appropriate context. But there is the possibility where one is not spiritually trained for that to become a kind of addiction. You could say there's an anger addiction that some people have, where they are completely compelled just to look for whatever makes them angriest in the world. And that tends to be the basis for sort of extremist, fundamentalist interpretations of religion, which are very dichotomizing and unable to see the value in other people, and that everything is a continuum rather than just good on one side and bad on the other, which is certainly the Quranic or the prophetic way, which is why the Quran praises the Ahl al-Kitab. It's not a dichotomizing document. So, anger has a legitimate context, but the advice the Holy Prophet gave for people who are angry was, if you're angry, sit down. If you're still angry, lie down. Because 9 times out of 10, anger is from the ego and insecurity and fearfulness, and it's not from the best part of us. Righteous indignation, as the Christians used to call it, is quite an unusual virtue.
Mm-hmm. Some of us might be lying down quite a lot then these days. You also say something really beautiful. There's a beautiful reminder you mention in the book that a sage, it's to do with an airport and a wise man. So you say that a sage is not checking his texts at the airport by immigration. He or she is praying for the border agency's parents, family, and neighbours. And that really struck me that you can fill every moment, every mundane moment with grace and just compassion.
Yeah, and again, this is part of the Quranic virtue of tafakkur. And if you've been with very holy people, you'll see that they never waste a minute, because every minute is this gift in which God is doing something new and unrepeatable and extraordinary. So there's no mediocre minute in our lives. The saints have all said this, and you just have to see the miracle of it, and particularly the human miracle of it. So saintly people are always kind of looking to see, who is this person? Why are they sad? What is their story? And as it were, like as the Holy Prophet, when somebody spoke to him, he would always turn to him, إِذَا الْتَفَتَ جَمِيعًا, to give him his full attention. He would talk to him like that, would direct his attention to see, who is this person, and to understand them. And if you see human beings as made in the image of God and as being possessed of an immortal soul, which God cares about, then necessarily you'll be a real humanist rather than somebody who thinks it's just the selfish gene and he'll rot away and it doesn't matter ultimately. You'll be a real humanist, and you'll also learn something about God's purposes. And this is the Sufi tradition of the shahid, the witness, that one sees in the face of another human being some disposition, unique disposition of what God means, even if that person is not living up to what God is opening that person up to be. There's still something there that is unique and is precious, and this is really across the board in our sacred literature. The idea of the shahid is really universal and linked very much to ideas of divine compassion and divine love. William Chittick's new book on divine love in Islam has thousands of beautiful examples from tafsir and elsewhere on this idea of the shahid, of seeing the divine uniqueness of other human beings.
That is beautiful. Thank you so much. I think now we will go to the audience now for any questions that you might have that have been raised by our conversation. I can't see anybody apart from the front row right now, so could we have some lights on the audience? There is a boom mic going around, and Elise, I believe, has got that mic, got that power. Are you anywhere? There you are at the back. I just saw you. Okay, if there are any questions, please raise your hand and Elise will come to you. Otherwise, I've got plenty more questions. I can see some, yes, lady kind of in the, I don't even know what number row that is, but could you keep your hand raised? Thank you.
Yeah, I've just got a question. Just when you were talking about, like now in schools, teaching children about sexuality and choosing their genders, how we should or how we can approach that as Muslims, with our children and things. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, so how
Yep.
we should approach that.
It is a serious question, and since free speech in our society was abolished maybe 10, 15 years ago on a lot of these issues, let me put it like this. We know about the Batley cartoons disaster and the understandable hurt of Muslim communities regarding that. And the view of Justin Welby, the Archbishop of Canterbury, was that, well, free speech, Muslims there may be cut to the quick and mortified and losing sleep, but too bad, they just have to suck it up. And the far right was delighted. I don't know if the skinheads started going to evensong after that, but they enjoyed it. But then you have the case simultaneously of Bernard Randall, who is a Church of England vicar, who is was an RE teacher at an Anglican school with evangelical traditions, who said in a class, according to the Church of England, marriage is between one man and one woman. You can imagine what happens if you say something like that nowadays. He's sacked. And more than that, the school gives him a prevent referral. Okay, all he's doing is the vicar saying, according to my church, marriage is between a man and a woman. That apparently is implicitly terroristic. And then the same Justin Welby, when asked, are you going to support your own man for saying what your church teaches, he refuses to stand up for him and won't say anything. Which is, he throws him to the lions, basically. It's quite shocking. So we are moving into a very curious period, and I hope that eventually some kind of free speech discourse and respect for real diversity will emerge from these strange culture wars. Too early to say, but it is true. At the moment, religionists and not just Muslims feel extremely silenced and punched down upon, marginalized, despised, cancelled by many of these new beliefs. And that's not to say that one needs to take a view on the claims that are associated with them, merely to point out that conservative religious communities are feeling very bullied at the moment. What to do about that? I don't know. I gather that Bernard is now taking his school to court to see if he can sue them for unfair dismissal. If he wins, it'll be interesting to see if His Grace changes his tune. Don't know, but don't hold your breath.
Thank you for that question. I believe we have another one just at the back. Yeah.
Can I just say thank you so much for coming up from Cambridge, and we really, really enjoyed your talk, and thank you, Ramona, and Farhanda and everybody else who organised this. When you talked about the Bangladeshi, I think was it an imam who knew the Rumi Masnavi off by heart, and there were issues of language, In Bradford as well, we have many, many elders who know Rumi, who know Sheikh Sadi, who know Allama Iqbal. And sometimes I wonder that the problem isn't that they're communicating in English. The problem might be that we haven't taught Urdu, or we haven't taught Punjabi, or we haven't taught these sorts of languages. Because there's another issue, isn't there? So, for example, with Punjabi poetry, it's very difficult to translate them. Number one. Number two, I just wanted to say that thank you for telling us about Morocco, but Pakistan has planted over 1 billion trees, and it's number 4 in the world. And I just wanted to add by saying that England is way behind the government targets to plant the trees. I wonder what your view on languages, religion, and the current socio-economic situation is in education. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. I think obviously we want the great Muslim literate languages to flourish. Realistically, most people in the second generation, certainly the third, are not going to know those languages. That's just the nature of the assimilation process. That's how things are. So instead, what I think we need to look forward to is what Islam historically always did, because those languages were not always Islamic languages. They were Islamized. Muslims went into their spaces, saw their richness, and started to use them in order to proclaim Islamic truths. Often the Sufis, the Chishtis, and so forth were the people who were doing that. So we need to do the same to English now, not hoping that our grandchildren will be good at Punjabi. Inshallah, that will continue, but recognizing that whatever other languages they speak, they'll be speaking English, and to make sure that there is a rich English, devotional, spiritual, adventurous literature available for them in their own language that they can inhabit, feeling that this is part of the mainstream of their culture rather than something that they can occasionally log on to. And this is already starting to happen. There's some good British Muslim poets. The English language is a very capacious thing, I think, and sometimes there are issues regarding the use of religious vocabulary that has specifically Christian associations, and I think some Jewish poets have issues with that as well. But I'm fairly optimistic. I think we're still at the beginning of the road, but Islam will fill this space as it historically filled the Turkish space, the Persian space, the Malay space, the Wolof, Hausa space, and so forth. Islam is a great invigorator of languages. You think the Arabs conquered Persia, but the great era of Persian literature was after the conquest, not before. It wasn't Zoroastrian or Magian Persia that gave us Nizami, Rumi, Sa'di, and the others who you cited. It was Islamic Persia. Islam seems to have this capacity for cultural fecundation, for turning things into gold. And I hope that that will be one of the benign things that Islam brings to Western Europe as well.
Thank you. Are there any more questions? Yes, there are quite a few more questions, actually. I think there are about 4 more questions. So, yeah, go to the gentleman.
Assalamu alaikum, Shaykh. Jazakallah for your talk. In areas like Bradford, we have quite a lot of isolated Muslim communities. And I was wondering if you thought the future of Muslims in Europe is in these communities that are more isolated as a means of almost like protecting our faith and limiting our exposure to some of the vices and anti-Muslim sentiments out there? Or do you feel that will do more to propagate those anti-Muslim sentiments, and we should be spreading our wings out more and making more efforts to integrate into the wider community?
Yeah, I think that's an interesting question. Not just one that affects Muslim communities, but very many people from other communities are also deeply unhappy with the way in which society is moving. 1 in 4 young British women have self-harmed now. It used not to be like that. In the last 10 years, antidepressant prescriptions have doubled in this country. We have a minister of loneliness now. So, in a sense, Muslims are confronted with the demand or the request to integrate into something that in some respect is disintegrating. And how can one do that? So many people exist in silos, very often online silos, and communities are definitely breaking down. It's not the government narrative. They want us all to kind of join hands and sing Kumbaya in some kind of happy English utopia, but that society is quite fragmented and broken now. As I came through Leeds, there was a big poster on the station platform saying that there's 9 million people suffering from loneliness in the UK now, and you can call this number to become a buddy for someone. So mainstream society doesn't really have the obvious right to demand that people comply with its social norms when those social norms are presiding over so much asociality. There's ways in which, on our own terms, as Muslims, we can integrate and be positive, and being good neighbours to non-Muslims is something that's there in the Sunnah, and we shouldn't be anything other than that. But there is a sense in which religious communities always want to maintain a distance as well. And again, it's a question of watch this space. Part of the problem for religionists now is that Western society is changing so incredibly fast. It's very hard to know what you're planning for. But it seems that the current fragmentation of society into smaller and smaller units will continue, and the loss of local community and social capital will continue. I live in a village, for instance, in Cambridgeshire, and the village has now lost its shop, it's lost its post office, there's one pub that's holding on, there's a phone box, but there's no telephone in it any longer. The village school is now converted into some desirable residence. The church has evensong once a month. So society is really unravelling quite fast, even in idyllic English villages. In the inner city, it can be much more rough and difficult and painful for many people. So, yeah, the question is a good one. To what extent can we get close to something that is breaking apart so rapidly? I think we should. And you can't engage in the da'wah responsibility unless you are engaging with other kinds of people all the time. But we should be doing it from our own perspective of witnessing, of showing something better, of service, of seeing the divine in everybody, rather than just because government believes in some kind of society as a kind of blender in which migrant communities are thrown and is blended up in a couple of generations, everybody is the same. I don't think that's a vision that we can buy into. It's not good for the country anyway. Diversity is good for us.
Thank you. I think we've got time for about 2 more questions. So I'm going to leave it to Elise to choose. I'm sorry.
Assalamu alaikum and good afternoon. A bit on a negative point. So we see that an organisation like the National Secular Society, which in its essence is against any type of religious belief, but from when you look at their campaigns or articles that they run, most of them are targeted as Muslims, as at our core values and core beliefs. And I know you cover a lot of this in your book, but is there an organisation or a pool of scholars from the Muslim community who are counteracting this type of organised attack on everything to do with Muslims and Islam?
Well, in a sense, it's natural and perhaps a source of pride for us that we are attacked by those people. They think that Lambeth Palace has given up and isn't really worth targeting any longer, but we stick to our guns. We don't change our liturgy. Ramadan is not changing. Our basic forms and ideals are remarkably intact. And so, of course, they will attack us. The ulama, well, who are the ulama? They're the really traditional types who don't really know English very well and are employed because they come from a particular set of villages somewhere in the northern Punjab, and you can't reasonably expect those people to deal with postmodern critiques coming from the National Secular Society. It's not realistic. The newer generation tend not to be running the mosques, but I think as time moves on, we will see a growth of a Muslim intelligentsia that is capable of making that fight, and something like Cambridge Muslim College, which I'm involved with, is trying to produce a new generation of Muslim thought leaders that can push back against what are, when you actually look at them, extremely ill-considered and ill-informed attacks. It doesn't take very long to bat those things away. They're kind of nuisance attacks, really, rather than anything serious. But still, most of the community is kind of too preoccupied with bread and butter survival issues really to get into that kind of da'wah scenario. But things are certainly a lot better than they were, heaven help me, 40 years ago when I first became a British Muslim, when there was nobody and nothing. Things are not good now, but they're a lot better than they were.
Thank you. And we've got the next question.
Assalamu alaikum, Shaykh. You alluded to, and it's something that I've felt very strongly for a while, that the place and the time that we find ourselves in is very, very unique when in a complete historical sort of perspective, with the kind of rise of atheism and there being zero sense of the sacred in that sense. So my question is there a particular practice that is best suited for us to engage in this unique time and place to help us best preserve our sense of the sacred?
Well, you have to become a saint, really, because the Quran says there is no fear and no grief upon God's saints. If you see everything as being what he is doing and his sometimes unfathomable wisdom, everything is fine. You may not understand how it's fine, but it's fine. And so there's no huzn and no khawf. And there's particular adhkar that are recommended for times of turbulence and forms of dhikr for protection. Istighfar and durood, particularly effective in such times. And not having gigantic expectations of other people. So a religious narrowness that starts to hyperventilate when it sees people not complying 100% with lots of little details. It's just inappropriate in times such as these. And sometimes there can be a kind of competitive virtue signaling in our communities, that we do this prayer and you don't do that prayer and we have this, and it's very ridiculous. So sometimes there's an ostentatious piety and therefore a marginalizing of people who can't be that pious. So I think lowering our expectations, being more merciful with people, trusting in God, and because of the spiritual emergency here, people are actually joining us. So in our mosque in Cambridge, we register one shahada every week now, and that number seems to be going up. So that's 50 people a year. So if you do that in 1,000 UK mosques, that's 50,000 new Muslims every year, that's 500,000 by the time the next census happens, and then the Daily Mail will really have something to write about. So I think we use the spiritual void as an opportunity to help people who are looking for something, and there's a lot of people who are looking for guidance. We shouldn't despair of any soul.
Do we have time for one more question? Can we squeeze one more question in? Yes, great.
Assalamu alaikum. Thank you for your talk. My question was, to what extent do you think technology has influenced people's beliefs? And I had a second one, forgive me. And do you believe that Islam can truly thrive instead of just survive here?
Well, that's two questions. Is she allowed two questions?
I think.
If she gets too short
because she was so
answers,
concise in the questions.
I mean, technology is just a method, but it does tend to have to lead to certain social outcomes. So the internet allows you to learn Arabic online. That's fine. But it also means that every 12-year-old is 2 clicks away from humanity's worst nightmares. So the school I went to in London, which was 45 years ago, they were letting girls in for the first time. I remember with what respect the boys treated those girls. It was still the age where one wanted to be a gentleman. And we never heard of any harassment or anything. Nothing. Now that school is exploding in a crisis because of thousands of cases of harassment and obscene language. We know what the reason is. Pornhub is a bigger corporation now than Netflix. That's what technology enables. Human beings will sink to the lowest common denominator, and the result, for women in particular, is obviously calamitous. So technology, by and large, does drag us down. It doesn't drag us up so much as it drags us down. The future, of course, the future is in God's hands. We have to be hopeful. Holy Prophet loved optimism. Kan yuhibbul fa'l. And I do see so many people. Recently, an Israeli settler contacted me and said he was thinking of converting to Islam. A Benedictine monk emailed me yesterday very excited about Arabic and I think may become Muslim, a guy from Malta. There's a lot of spiritual hunger out there. So if we can convert our mosques into centres for da'wah, then yeah, let's be optimistic.
And that's a perfect way to end our session. Shaykh Abdal Hakim Murad will be signing copies of Travelling Home and also Contentions, his other book, at Waterstones, if you'd like to make your way over there after this session. Thank you all for your questions. Thank you to that baby who's been amazing throughout this entire session. Thank you all, and just join me in thanking the Shaykh for another enlightening and compelling session.